And so America is at this hour completing the 52nd day of having a president of the United States whose brain does not work. Donald Trump's brain is broken, badly damaged, as he exhibits every day. And once again today, Donald Trump said something that would have gotten any other president rushed to the hospital for a neurological examination and an evaluation for dementia. For starters, that's where they would have begun. It was a vile anti-Semitic outburst by the man who once said this after he saw a black accountant working at one of his failed casinos. Quote, "Black guys counting my money. I hate it. The only kind of people I want counting my money are short guys that wear yarmulkes every day. Those are the kind of people I want counting my money. No one else." That is how the anti-Semitic president of the United States sees Jewish men, little short men who wear yarmulkes every day. That's Donald Trump. Donald Trump spewed this demented poison today. What the poison we will get to. It came out of him in response to this question. Are you planning to lower corporate taxes to Ireland? Well, we are planning to lower taxes. Yeah, if the Democrats behave, but the Democrats have no clue. Are you planning to lower corporate taxes like Ireland? There's Donald Trump sitting in the Oval Office today with the head of the Irish government, asked a question about corporate taxes in Ireland and the United States, which then got him rambling on for a few completely irrelevant paragraphs that could never be called an answer. And then he ended his response to that question about corporate taxes with this hateful statement about Chuck Schumer. Schumer is a Palestinian, as far as I'm concerned. You know, he's become a Palestinian. He used to be Jewish. He's not Jewish anymore. He's a Palestinian. Not a single Republican anywhere in America who claims to be a staunch supporter of Israel and the Jewish people rose up to object to Donald Trump declaring Chuck Schumer to not be Jewish anymore. So Donald Trump, who has no idea what it is to be Jewish or Palestinian, now decides who is Jewish in this country. Only in his own perverse, deeply perverse brain could he do that. But the disgrace of every elected Republican in Washington is that not one of them dares to complain about that kind of poison coming out of the foul mouth of Donald Trump. And not one of them worries about the mental capacity of the kind of person who can say that, who, oh, by the way, has access to the nuclear codes while he's saying things like that. Donald Trump's mind is gone. It is shattered. You just saw that. There is no recognizable neurological function going on there. Not a single person who ever tries to interpret Donald Trump for you and defensively tries to tell you what Donald Trump meant when he says something insane ever uses the actual words of Donald Trump to explain Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump, who once said, "I have the best words," says things all the time, every day, that make absolutely no sense and frequently are filled snorts with hatred. He's not Jewish anymore. So the United States of America now has a head of state who decides who's Jewish and who isn't. Who else had a head of state who did that? Ever heard of a head of state doing anything like that? You have to be in your 90s to remember the last time the world had a head of state who decided who was Jewish and who was not. That was one of Adolf Hitler's first ideas about how to govern Germany. First of all, decide who's Jewish and who is not. The people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th and made their way to the Senate were heard saying, "Where's the big Jew?" They meant Chuck Schumer, who had just become the first Jewish majority leader of the United States Senate in history the day before the attack. And that was not lost on Trump supporters who attacked the Capitol wearing clothing celebrating the Holocaust. Robert Keith Packer was wearing his Camp Avets hoodie. What would he have done if he had found Chuck Schumer? While Donald Trump's supporters were looking for Chuck Schumer saying, "Where's the big Jew?" Donald Trump was silent for 187 minutes. If Donald Trump was ever going to say Chuck Schumer isn't Jewish, maybe then. Maybe then, when his people were walking around the Senate saying, "Where's the big Jew?" Nazis invaded the capital of the United States looking for Chuck Schumer. 76 years after Nazis were rounding up and executing members of Chuck Schumer's family in Nazi death camps. And today, the poisonous broken brain of Donald Trump said, he used to be Jewish. He's not Jewish anymore. All of these sane people in the world, all of the same people in America, all of the same people in the Republican Party, the sane ones do not have to work hard to not say things like that. They are not spending their day and their energy fighting the impulse to say Chuck Schumer is not Jewish anymore because they are not insane. On CNBC yesterday, the normally mild-mannered, very pro-business Steve Lehman used a word I've never heard him use before in his analysis of the economy or the stock market or anything else. It was the word insane, and he applied it to Donald Trump. I'm going to say this at risk of my job, Kelly, but what President Trump is doing is insane. It is absolutely insane. It is about the 8th reason we've had for the tariffs. And now he's saying he's putting 50% tariffs on Canada unless they agree to become the 51st state. That is insane. There's just no other way of describing it. That's enough for Donald Trump to call Steve Lehman a Palestinian. That's enough for Donald Trump to say he's not Jewish anymore. Steve Lehman is not a short guy with a yarmulke. So maybe Donald Trump thinks Steve Lehman doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to anything financial or economic. It took an insane person to make Steve Lehman use the word insane in describing what Donald Trump is doing to the economy and the stock market with his tariffs. And it took an insane person to say Schumer is a Palestinian, as far as I'm concerned. You know, he's become a Palestinian. He used to be Jewish. He's not Jewish anymore. He's a Palestinian. Okay, that's what Donald Trump's last word was. Okay, no, not okay. And it's not okay that we live in a country where that is not a story. It is not okay. Where the New York Times, which is read by more Jewish people than any other newspaper in the world, doesn't have a story about the President of the United States deciding that the Senate Democratic leader is not Jewish anymore. Once again, imagine what the New York Times would do if Joe Biden had said that. How many inches high would the headline be on page 1 about Joe Biden or any other president saying that? But Donald Trump's most insane statements, including the ones filled with bigotry and hatred, now just slip through the cracks, the very big cracks in the American news media. And most people in Israel and most people in the world, most people in America, most Jewish people will not know that the only president of the United States in history who can legitimately be described as insane has decided and announced that Chuck Schumer is not Jewish anymore. And we're told we have to select our outrage with Donald Trump. I understand that we can't be outraged at everything we're told. I guess that's true. But the problem with that approach is that too many reporters and too many members of the news media are learning not to be outraged by anything. And that is exactly what happened in the Oval Office today. Because when Donald Trump finished saying he's a Palestinian, and then he turned to the reporters saying, okay, meaning I'm ready to take another question, not one of them said a word to him about what he just said about Chuck Schumer. That was one of the most disgraceful public moments in the history of the Oval Office, if not the most disgraceful, possibly outdone only by Donald Trump in other Oval Office moments. And not one White House reporter screamed at Donald Trump about that. Not one of them said a word to Donald Trump, asked a single question to Donald Trump about when he became in charge of deciding who is Jewish. Remember how they used to scream at Joe Biden? Remember that sound? That wasn't there today after Donald Trump said Chuck Schumer is not Jewish anymore. You know what they'll tell you? They'll say, well, he didn't mean it. White House reporters will tell you that. They'll say he didn't mean it. When someone doesn't mean what they're saying, there's supposed to be something in the delivery that makes that apparent, especially if it's a joke, for example. Let's take a look. Let's take a look at Donald Trump saying this one more time. And when you look at this, see if you can find the slightest hint that he doesn't mean every word of this. Schumer is a Palestinian, as far as I'm concerned. You know, he's become a Palestinian. He used to be Jewish. He's not Jewish anymore. He's a Palestinian. And then he turns and says, okay, to the reporters. I guess it was okay with them. Donald Trump didn't say a single thing today with more seriousness than he said he's not Jewish anymore. And Donald Trump said that sitting beside Ireland's head of state in an annual visit around St. Patrick's Day, which is Monday, to celebrate the Irish contribution to American life. The Irish head of state always comes to the White House around this time of year, around March 17th. Michael Martin is the leader of a country whose people take their Irish identity very seriously. Irish Americans have been known to take their Irish identity sometimes too seriously, like on St. Patrick's Day, when they can cause a traffic jam here and there. But saying Chuck Schumer isn't Jewish anymore is the numerological equivalent of saying Michael Martin, the head of the Irish government sitting beside Donald Trump in the Oval Office, isn't Irish anymore. Go ahead, Donald. Turn to him and say that to him. Turn to him in the Oval Office and say to him, he's not Irish anymore. Because what you don't know, Donald Trump, is that the Irish government has a much more sympathetic posture toward Palestinians than Chuck Schumer ever has. Much more. And you wouldn't dare, Donald Trump, to turn to Michael Martin and say, you're not Irish anymore. You're a Palestinian. Wouldn't dare. Donald Trump has a broken brain that leaks ugly poison every day, and it cannot be fixed. It is getting worse. It is worse on day 52 of his presidency than it was on the first day of his presidency this time, and it will be worse on the 100th day of his presidency, and it will be worse, much, much worse on the 1,000th day of his presidency. And on this, the 52nd day of his presidency today, Donald Trump, the weakling, backed down in a very big way. Once again, we've seen Donald Trump's childish and now predictably weak backing down on his ridiculous tariff game, his dangerously stupid tariff game that he's playing against Canada and Mexico and the world. Today, Donald Trump backed down on something that's even bigger to him, and it is much more important to his voters than tariffs, which is why Donald Trump is using the tariff game and the madness it has created to distract from his biggest broken promise to his followers and his biggest failure so far, and that is mass deportation. There have been no mass deportations, none. And the breaking news of the night is the New York Times reporting ICE returns all migrants from Guantanamo to stateside facilities. That's right, all of them. And there were very few there. Remember the promises of the 30,000 people who were going to be scooped up in the United States and sent straight to Guantanamo. 30,000. He didn't even send 300, not even 1/10 of 1% of what he said he was going to do. And now he's given up on Guantanamo and doesn't want you to know it. The New York Times reports as of Friday, according to a court filing this week, 290 migrants from 27 countries have since cycled through the base. As of Friday, the court filing said 17 migrants were being held in a medium security facility, a dormitory-style building on the other side of the base from the wartime prison where 23 were in Camp 6. So that is a grand total of 40 as of last week. 40 people detained by Donald Trump at Guantanamo Bay as of Friday. And now there are none. Zero. The operation has so far cost $16 million, according to representatives of the Guantanamo Migrant Detention Mission, who briefed a congressional delegation during a visit last week. It has a staff of 1,000 security forces and civilian contractors, many of them mobilized from military bases in the United States. In other words, many of them mobilized from military bases in the United States for no reason to go to Guantanamo and do nothing. A complete Trumpian waste of money while his court jester Elon Musk is trying to pretend that he's the one who's finding the waste in the federal government. Immigration law specialists have questioned the legal basis for the operation, arguing that the act does not authorize the government to transfer people to the soil of another unrelated country without its consent, nor, they said, does it provide authority to detain people outside the territorial United States, which appears to exclude Guantanamo. That is what Donald Trump is trying to hide. That's why he's illegally using federal property to try to sell Elon Musk's cars, which American buyers are turning away from, apparently because they don't want to be accused of driving what could be interpreted as the rolling version of a Nazi salute, thanks to Elon Musk's disgraceful public antics. That's what that car has become in the minds of some. Antics that the president of General Motors doesn't do, idiotic antics that the president of Ford doesn't do, hateful posts on social media that the presidents of other automobile companies don't do. And because the people running General Motors and Ford don't publicly disgrace themselves every day, people can buy electric cars from General Motors and Ford without fear of the very car itself associating the driver with any political position at all. The speaker criticizes Donald Trump for avoiding questions about Guantanamo Bay during recent public appearances at the White House. Instead of addressing policy matters, the speaker suggests Trump focused on unrelated or controversial statements, including remarks about Chuck Schumer. The criticism also targets Trump's border advisor, Tom Homan, accusing him of pressuring local leaders in cities like Boston, despite Boston having one of the lowest crime rates among major U.S. cities. According to the speaker, promised large-scale deportations have not materialized as pledged. The argument continues by pointing to economic concerns, claiming that inflation has increased, grocery prices, including eggs, have risen sharply, and the stock market has declined. Meanwhile, Guantanamo Bay remains empty rather than being used to detain the large numbers of criminals Trump previously said would be quickly identified and removed. The speaker concludes by arguing that, so far, the only people who have lost their positions are American government employees, framing this as the situation 52 days into Trump's presidency.